that's attended today. So you'll get a copy of the recording, or a link to it, I should say, as well as links to related files and documentation that relate to the content of the webinar. Before we jump in, Sophie, is there anything I'm missing? Anything that I haven't touched on before we get into the content here?
No, I think we're good. I'd just love to do a quick check-in with everyone out there. Is everyone able to hear us clearly? We have had someone who has had trouble calling in, so I just want to make sure that everyone's good to go. If you don't mind just maybe sending me a quick message through that question section or not, that would be awesome.
Perfect. Looks like I'm seeing some questions popping in there, so it's probably a few people letting you know that they can hear you fine, so that's good. But Sophie, if we do have any issue, just let me know, and we'll troubleshoot it.
Awesome. Thank you. And I'm glad to hear Kansas can hear us. Thanks, Jessica.
Okay. All right. So let's jump in here. So we're looking at the function point system. We're looking at a dashboard. This is a dashboard that I've created with some tiles and some content that I like. But we're going to get right into the estimates module. The estimates module is very directly tied to the jobs module. In a lot of ways, they essentially are the same module in some cases. It really depends on if you share client-facing versions of your estimates, or if that's a stage where you're not turning things into jobs immediately. But they do share information, interchangeably. So adjusting one area will adjust the other. Selecting Add Estimate will bring us to our Add Estimate page, where a lot of these fields are job-specific. Your estimate name will become your job name. Your estimate type will become your job type. So these are important things to keep in mind, that the information does flow. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and build out an estimate. I'm going to move through some of the stuff that's pretty obvious, and then I'm going to pause on some of the things that are not so obvious and can be quite important for future reporting, tracking, workflow, things like that. So I'm going to call this webinar brochure. Now, one thing I do like to mention to people is naming conventions on estimates and jobs is important. Let's say that I'm doing this for a client. In this case, I'm going to say it's my client Safeway. Usually, I like to tell people to have the name be something that a person can look at and know immediately what it's for. So what I would often do is put something like, Safeway webinar brochure, or whatever terminology, code, or information that would allow your staff to look at the name and know exactly what it's all about. The estimate type, I'm going to select brochure in this case, keeping it really simple, just doing some print collateral in this example. We're going to choose our contact. If you don't have a contact, I really do recommend adding one. There is some functionality specific to a contact existing, so you do want to fill that in. The AE can fill in based on the company, but of course we can change that. The AE is going to automatically become a contact on the job. And a common question we get is, how can we get more of those? I'm going to touch on that in a second as well. We can relate this to an existing project if one already does exist. Our rate category can fill in automatically if we have a default for that client or a default for the system in general. But if you do have different rate categories, you can select those. We are going to touch on rates on the next page. Then there's some other optional fields, PO number if it's applicable. There's also a field here called close probability. If you are using the system as as a tool for a method of pipeline reporting, looking at potential opportunities, then putting in a close probability can assist with that type of reporting. If I'm maybe 90% sure that this will close, I can enter 90%. And the month close is when I expect that to happen, and I expect them to sign off on that this month. The description, this will translate into a few different areas as well, so I usually don't recommend glossing over it. It's just the overall description of the job. I'm going to put something in there really quickly. We then have the delivery date, and this is something I see blank all the time, and I can't stress enough how much I would love to see delivery dates filled in on every estimate in every system. Even if you don't know exactly what that's going to be, just guess it or something. I mean, obviously, if it just doesn't make sense at all to put anything here, then don't. But when you can, I highly recommend trying to put in a delivery date there. It's really important to the jobs later on. There's then a couple fields that I want to touch on here that are really important as well, and I'm going to talk about why they're important, how they relate to your reporting, and then we're going to check in with Sophie for any questions. Category. By default, unless your agency has changed the default terminology, this is what you're going to find. Category is meant to represent how you intend to bill something. Is it retainer, is it time materials, or is it fixed price? Filling in this category can really help your billing processes later on, which we're going to see in the invoicing webinar in 2 weeks' time. I highly recommend filling that out when you can and when you are aware of how you intend to bill something. Work type is going to be blank in your system. In fact, it's typically going to be turned off, and you can't turn it on if there's an additional label that you want to place on things. But it's usually just kind of a higher label as to what overall type of work. I might have a lot of different types of print work, brochure being one of them, but this allows me to narrow a lot of different types of reports down by an overall work type. It can be a very useful field. Now, there's one other thing that I want to touch on here before we move away from this page, and that is the ability to add additional contacts to a job automatically from this page. Notice this blank area here, so this big blank space. You can fill this in with the ability to add additional contacts. And this is a big problem solver for a lot of people. I'm going to show you where to turn that on, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what it does. I'm going to open this up in a different tab. So I'm hovering over Admin, System Setup, System Preferences. I'm going to right-click on it and open that in a new tab. In my System Preferences, there's an area called Track. And there's a button called Lead Contacts. Turning this on means that when I go to add an estimate, I will then have additional contacts from my own company that I can choose to be a client lead and a lead creative. And you can decide what those terms mean to you, but it's just a way of having people automatically show up as job contacts. That's something that not a lot of people are aware of, but can actually save you a whole bunch of time from having to do that manually later on. This can relate to reporting, it can relate to alerts, it can relate to project management capabilities. So if you want certain people automatically on jobs, it's a fantastic way of doing that. That's less time consuming. Now we're going to touch on the services. Sophie, I think we're good on questions, but I'll just check in anyways. Anything that I'm missing or any questions that you think I should address at this time?
Yeah, you know what, there was one really good question that came in from Robin. I think you did touch on it, but just to reiterate, using that estimate contact, we do recommend that being your main point of contact at your client's office, just so everyone is aware of who the best person to reach out there is, and then utilizing the AE and the other two that Mark just showed you how to turn on for your internal contacts.
That's correct. And if you need additional client contacts, you can always add those to the job later as well. So we're now going to choose our service structure. And this is, of course, specific to your agency. I always recommend less is more. I'm going to choose a couple. I might skip over a couple. I'm going to say research, design, copy production, and client management. I'm also going to choose a freelancer as an expense here, say that we need a freelancer. And then lastly, I'm going to choose some expenses, and that's going to be, in this case, let's say printing. Once we have the structure that we need there, we'll click submit, and it'll bring us into our estimates details page. Now, a lot of this is pretty straightforward, but there are some things here that you can do and that people might not be aware of that I want to touch on, and also some really important points to make for common mistakes that I would advise that you avoid. So I'm going to take you through those. So of course we have our service group, we have our description. This is typically the description that shows on printouts, depending on your preferences. We can then go ahead and build out our structure here, our value. Now, a lot of the time, a lot of agencies I speak with might not be producing client-facing versions of these documents, but pricing the item out is really important. And if you can do so using hours, all the more power to you. Your reporting is only going to be better for it, even if it may not be exactly what you expect it to take. Filling in a value here is helpful. I'm going to say 5 hours for research, calculates our rate, gives us our value. Now, if you do need to make an adjustment, this is how you want to do it. Let's say for design, I want to charge, let's say $2,500. Now, of course, I can put in here 25 hours. If I expect this is going to take a little bit longer, I might want to put a budget of 30 hours, but I only intend to charge them $2,500. Please do not change the rate. You want to change the override value and use the override field to control the dollar amount to get to your total. I see a lot of manipulation of the override field. That's great. Go to town as much as you want. I also see some manipulation of rates here. Usually not a good idea. I'd recommend avoiding that when you can. You also have the ability of adding staff and roles, which I do hear from time to time that people are not aware of. Let's say I want copywriting done by a specific copywriter, and also I'm going to involve my creative director on this as well because he has some good copywriting skills, but I'm going to charge more for his work. So I'm going to add 2 individuals by selecting the plus icon here, and I can say that I want this done by a copywriter. Maybe I'm not even really sure which one, so I'm going to choose the role of copywriter, and the copywriter rate fills in. Or of course, if I chose a specific person, then that person's rate will fill in. And I'm also going to have this worked on by our creative director. They're going to come in and they're going to put in a little bit of time. Alon's going to work on this. And as you can see, Alon, his rate is higher. And I'm then putting in some hours. So Jeremy, our copywriter, is going to work on this for 10 hours. And Alon's going to supervise, going to come in and put about 2 hours of work on this. It's giving me a total of $1,300. That is how you can then use those staff rates and those role rates in order to build out something that's more specific to the rates that you have. I'm just going to put in a few more values here. We'll say maybe another 10 hours for production, another 10 hours for client management. We then have our freelancer, and this is a common thing that is not client facing, and that is why I have this external expense of freelancer not in my expenses category, but in my creative services category, because I don't want my client to know that we're hiring a freelancer, for artwork. I don't want them to see that. So I'm embedding freelancer within my creative services category, and I expect that they're going to work for us for 4 hours, and they're going to charge us $50 an hour. And we're going to mark that up by, in this case, 100%. So from 200 marked up 100% to $400. Lastly, we have our actual expense, which is printing, and I expect to print, let's say, 2,000 copies of this, and it's going to be 50 cents a copy. So it's $1,000. Normally we'd mark it up by 20%, but I know that my client has a budget of $8,000. We're at $7,900, so I'm just going to jump this up to $1,300, get us to a nice even $8,000. Notice again how I'm using the override field to get to the amount that I want. So those are kind of the basics of how you're building this out and the different ways that you can go about doing it. What I want to show now, I want to talk a little bit about printouts. Before I do that, actually, I'll check in with Sophie. Sophie, anything that you have that you think we should talk about on screen here?
Hey, Mark. Yeah, thanks for checking in. I think I've got most of the questions in here. There was a pretty good one. People are just wondering about the estimate terms. Is that going to be touched on in your printout section next, or?
Yeah, good point. Let's take a look at the printout, and then I'll show how you can adjust that and where that comes from.
Awesome. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, so let's take a look at the printout here, and I want to show just a few different options, including a really cool customization feature that I've seen people utilize in really interesting and creative ways. So the first thing I'm going to do is up at the top, I'm going to select the print button, and I'm going to look at the different printouts that I have. I'm going to produce this simple example. I'm also going to produce another one, and in fact, what I'll do is I'm going to enter a description for the printing, just because I like that to show up on the document. And then maybe we'll reproduce that. Then I'm going to produce 2 versions. So we might have a version that's showing just the category level. This is what I find is the most common thing to do. But of course, you can expand that out to include more information if you want to. But this is a good example of that freelancer item being visible there. Sometimes I see people will have expenses called things like artwork or graphic design. So instead of calling your expense freelancer, you might call the expense graphic design if you have clients for which you need to show a detailed breakdown of the services. That allows you to show the line item and not have it be labeled as an outside hire. Now, one thing that I want to show is something that you could do around brand templates. And I've seen some really creative usage of these features. What I'm talking about is the idea of uploading a file on which the estimate will then be laid on top of. And you can do some different things with it. So I put together a brand template here. A brand template is basically a PDF. And it's a PDF with whatever you want it to have, as long as part of it is blank space. So I have a brand template with one page with some information. I just pulled it from the ebook just to have some text. And then I have a second page that's blank. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go into my printout section. So I'm going into admin, system setup, and printing preferences. And I've already uploaded that brand template. So it's in here. So you just go to brand templates and upload it. It's very simple as long as you've created a PDF. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to that standard estimate printout that we looked at just a second ago. Actually, no, let's do this simple. I'm going to choose a simple. And I'm just going to edit this. And I'm going to relate this printout to the brand template. Now, we have a lot of documentation on how to do printout customization and things like that. I'll make sure to include that in the post-webinar follow-up email. But for now, I just want to show a little bit about what you can do. If I navigate back to that estimate, notice now that my simple version has this first page of text or images or contract terms. I chose for it to be the first page. It could be the second page. In fact, this relates to that terms question. Instead of just a couple lines of text, if you have 2 or 3 pages of contract terms you need to show up on the bottom of your estimate, you can upload those as a brand template. And then on the second page is the estimate itself. There's a whole bunch of really cool stuff that you could come up with this feature. So get creative with it if it's something that you think would benefit you. Now, on the topic of terms, actually, before I forget to touch on that, the terms are going to show up as an item just at the bottom. Terms and conditions are selected on the first page, or you can edit the estimate to choose your terms. You can have multiple terms, and the terms are handled in the admin section under an area called list maintenance. So I'm not going to go in there, but that's where you can go ahead and edit your terms. So the next thing that we're going to touch on is revenue schedules. And this is something that I don't see utilized as much as it probably should be, because it's a really cool feature. There's some powerful reporting that can come out of this. And it can be pretty easy to use. It can also be pretty manual and tedious if you want it to be, which I have some experience in, but I think Sophie does as well. But it can also be quite automated, which is nice. So let me first kind of go over a little bit about what I'm talking about. And we are going to get into margins and cost rates and things like that just after the revenue schedule piece. So on the estimates, you're going to notice a tab called revenue schedule. Revenue schedule is basically an area where you can add in line items that represent dates. So line items that represent when it is that you expect to bill. So I might have, in this case, my first invoice is going to go out today. And I'm going to have that go out for, let's say, 50% of my internal services. I'm not going to bill the expense until it's occurred. My internal service value is $6,300. So in that case, I guess half of that would be, what would that be, $3,150. So in my internal services, I'm going to put in $3,150. So there's my $3,150. Notice it's telling me the difference in total is $3,150 because it was half. I'm then going to have another invoice, let's say halfway through April, for the remaining $3,150. And then on the due dates, we're going to invoice them for the expense, which is for $1,700. So that includes our freelancer and our printing. So that's, in this case, because our freelancer happens to be an external expense. So that's an example of how you can then build out line items that represent dates in which you intend to bill. Now, I've just given an example where the line items that I've put together are manually created. You don't necessarily need to have that happen. There is another option, and I'm going to get to that page really quickly just by creating a copy of this, just to give you an example. When you are editing your estimate, at the very bottom left corner, there's a button that says Auto Revenue Forecast. So any estimate you're creating at any time, you look down at the bottom left, you're going to see Auto Revenue Forecast. Clicking this button will take 100% of the value of the estimate and drop it onto the due date of the estimate within the revenue schedule. So it takes the due date and it takes the full value and it creates that one schedule, that one line item schedule for you. This is a single click opportunity to use this report. Even though it may not represent exactly when you're going to be collecting the revenue, it does represent when you expect to collect 100% of it. It's a very, very easy, non-labor intensive way of utilizing this feature. And I'm going to show you now the benefit of it and the report that it produces. So, and again, I'm also kind of showing there the auto revenue forecast, the importance of a due date and how due dates can help with a bunch of different things. So this revenue forecast information is going to go into a report under the report section, under plan, that's called our revenue forecast. Now, there's three versions of this: gross, outsourced, and net. Net is showing only your internal services and your internal expenses. Outsourced is showing only your external expenses, and gross is a combination. Honestly, I never see anyone use these. There probably is someone out there, somewhere that does prefer one of these and to exclude a certain form of the revenue. I never really see that done. I'd recommend just producing the gross. Now I'm going to narrow this down. I'm going to say, I only want to forecast this out for 3 months. Maybe we'll put 4 months. And I only want to see, let's just say, brochure estimates for now. You typically produce this for everything, but I'm just going to produce it for brochure. You can narrow it down by a variety of other filters. This report will open in Excel, and let me show you what you're getting here. So what you're getting is every estimate, and they could represent real jobs. So our webinar brochure is not open up to a job yet. All the others are. This will show you when you expect to be collecting revenue and how much. So in the current month, for all of our brochure work, we expect to bill $31.50. In the month of April, we have a bunch of brochures being finishing up. We have expected revenue of $33,040 and $12,500 in May. Our total forecasted revenue for all of our brochure work that is currently out there right now is $48,690. It's a very, very powerful forecasting tool that's very easy to use, especially if you do the auto feature. It can help with invoicing processes if you want to see a layout of who to bill and when and why. And it can also help the agency to plan based on what revenue you're expecting in the future. So it's something that it requires so little effort to use. I really would encourage everyone that's on the webinar today to give it a try. And I think that you'll find some valuable insight and data coming from that. So the next thing that we're going to jump into is cost rates. I think, Sophie, I saw you with a couple questions that you covered, but anything that you think I should touch on screen here?
Yeah, there actually was one really good question that came in from Jessica. So she's just talking about retainers, and they really just want to put a bulk amount against a specific estimate because they don't know where the hours are going to go. Now, of course, I've already explained that you can't do just one bulk amount for an entire estimate, but you can do the override fields for each individual service. Mark, would you mind just quickly showing that on screen for me?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm just going to give an example. Now, typically what I'd recommend is if you don't know, if you just want just a bulk dollar amount, notice I'm filling in the fields that I kind of religiously recommend filling in, like delivery dates and categories. So in this case, I'm going to say fixed price. But for the sake of time, I'll jump in here and just select my services. When you're working with just a bulk amount, you might not want to break things down into a really detailed service structure. The more that you can, the better. But of course, I understand that in the real world, you don't always have the time, or you might not know. So in this case, I'm just going to keep it simple. I'm going to keep it to design and copy. In fact, I'm just going to put it to just design for now. Maybe I'll build out more info later if I want to. But let's say I want to do a brochure. I want to charge my client $10,000. So I'm going to have one line item. I'm going to drop in $10,000 into an override field, save it. Enter my description here, brochure for, this and that. And I have now, a version that took me 2 seconds to create, and I can produce my client-facing version. This is the one that has the brand template on it, but there's just creative services for brochure for $10,000. So it's really simple. You don't need to put in a lot of detail if you don't have that detail at that time. Does that work, Soph? Anything that I'm missing there?
No, I think that's perfect. Thank you. It's just one of those things that you can explain it as much as you can, but nothing is better than just seeing it on screen. So thank you for doing that for me, Mark.
No problem. Okay, so a couple other things actually I want to touch on really, really quickly before we go into cost rates. Just a couple of tips and tricks. One is a common question we get all the time is, how can I show multiple options on an estimate? And I'm going to show you how to do that. The way that you want to show multiple options is by adding in additional service groups. So like in this case, and I'm going to collapse these so I'm not seeing all this info. So I have creative services and expenses. I'm actually just going to copy creative services. Now I have 2 versions. I'm just going to move it above expenses. Save that. And then now I'm going to call this, option A, and I'm going to call this option B. Now, of course, I want some difference in price. So maybe the difference in price is related to our expenses. Oh yeah, of course. So expenses is a bad example. Maybe our different options related to design work. So I'm going to bump this one up to 40 hours. In fact, I'm going to leave this one, but I'm going to put the second one to, let's say, 40 hours here and 20 hours of production. So the second option is going to be slightly more expensive. Now the printing might be, you might have multiple options for printing and things like that. The bottom line is build out the options within the service groups. Once you've done so, you want to have an estimate printout that doesn't show a total value for the estimate. And then I'd put in my description, please choose from the following options as to what works best for you. You might provide a more detailed breakdown, but we have our option A, our option B. They let you know which option they want to go with. Once they let you know which option you want to go with, a best practice from here is to come back into the estimate and up at the top right, select the button that says Create Revision. Selecting that is going to create a second version of this estimate, and you'll be able to come back and look at the original options that they had to choose from in the first version, and then note that in this case, delete option B, and they chose option A. So I now have my structure back to my $8,000 after going through that multi-option version. So now let's take a look at the concept of cost rates on estimates and how you can look at margins and potential profitability prior to any work being done. 2 things that I want to show here. When you are on this page, the natural state of this page, this service structure page on the estimate, is an editable version. What you want to do is click the button up at the top of this section that says View Services. When I select that, it gives me a non-editable version of my list of services. I'm going to collapse some of this for now. I'm going to expand it in a second. But notice now that I have some extra columns. So I have a cost column that I wasn't seeing before. So this is showing me the cost value of the work. These cost values are pulling from one of 2 areas in the system. I'm going to show you exactly where they're coming from and how to make sure that you have them populated in your system. The cost column is coming from one of 2 areas. If you have a staff person selected, like I do for copywriting, then the cost information is coming from the staff person's staff details page. So I would need to go into admin, rate and staff management, and go into my staff section. I'm going to open up in a new tab. I like doing that a lot so I don't have to navigate away. And this is where I'd go in and select Jeremy and see that Jeremy's cost is $25 an hour. So that's his cost rate, and that cost rate is being pulled in and used here. Where a staff person is not selected, the cost rates in this column are coming from, their cost values are coming from a cost rate in your admin section. Now, this is something that is not going to exist by default in your version of function point. You do need to create it in order for it to exist. And where you do that is in the admin section under rate and staff management within rate categories. Again, I'm going to right click it, new tab. In my rate categories, when I'm creating a new rate, there's an option to flag this as a cost rate. Doing so is going to make it unselectable as an actual rate category for a job, but this is your blended cost rate. And notice that I have a cost rate here called, I call it, Z cost rate. So it shows up at the bottom when in an alphabetical list. And then I can see my cost value. Now, that cost amount is meant to be a blended cost rate across the whole agency. So here's my rate structure. I have my standard rate of 100, my discount of 75, and my higher of 150. And then I have my cost rate of $30. When I add up all of my staff cost rates and I divide it by the number of people, I ended up with about $30. And the system will use that $30 to multiply the hours by to come up with a cost value where no staff are selected. Putting in that cost rate allows you to look at potential profitability, and it's also going to allow you to look at margin information. So there's a button here that says View Cost, Billable, and Margins. If I select that, it's going to give me a breakdown and show me my internal services. The cost for my time is about $2,000, just under. The billable value based on our rates is $6,300. The margin, our potential profit on this is $4,350, and that $4,350, as far as a percentage of our cost, is 223%. So when you want to know how is this amount being calculated, this amount is being calculated by comparing our cost value and then the margin amount. The margin amount being the difference between our cost and our billable. So, for example, if I were to just take a calculator just to show the cost real time, exactly how that's done, if I take this 1950 and I multiply it by two, in this case, 2.2308, I'm going to get my billable value. And of course, it's a small percentage there, so it's 6 cents off. But that's how it's being calculated. That's how that margin amount is being calculated, as a comparison between the margin as a percentage of the cost. And this is allowing us to see, are we hitting our margins? And I know that some of the more sophisticated agencies that I speak with have a baseline margin that they need to hit in order to be able to move forward with the job. And this is a very good way of being able to see that information before you open up the job. So if that prompted any questions related to these values, the rate categories, or this margin calculation at all?
You know what? This is usually a hot topic with some people when we host this webinar, but they all seem to be pretty quiet right now. You must have done a good job explaining it, I guess.
No problem. Well, one thing I'll mention as well is that calculated cost rates is something that I know a lot of people do struggle with. It can be a little bit tricky, but I do want to just point out again that in the profitability ebook, that is a file that's a handout within this webinar, you will get a really good breakdown of how to calculate staff cost rates and calculate staff billing rates. Really easy to follow, easy to understand breakdown of exactly how to come up with a staff person's hourly cost, and then blended rates for the agency, and also individual staff billing rates as well. So I do recommend checking out that file. It's pretty easy to follow, pretty easy to understand if you don't have those values, or it's actually a pretty interesting exercise, because a lot of agencies I speak with, they're more of a fixed price operation. They typically don't bill the time spent. I find that fixed price and retainers is more common, but usually you'll have rates in order to compare the value that you invoice to what you feel the value of the work is. And going through the process of working through these formulas and working through these calculations and comparing them to the rates that you currently value your time as can be an interesting exercise in understanding, how do kind of industry recommended best practices in calculating rates compared to the rates that you have at your organization. So I'd recommend that take the file and run through those formulas and see what comes out the other side. You never know. Maybe you'll find out you're charging a bit too much, a bit too little. I don't think I've ever heard of anyone saying they're charging too much, but you never know. Okay, so let's jump back into our agenda here. So the next thing, I think I'm seeing some stuff pop in there. Am I imagining that, or is there anything that you think I should touch on? Is there anyone that's kind of jumping in and mentioning some things they want me to cover?
Hey, Mark. Yeah, so we did just get a few questions that just came in. One good one from Tim. It's really more on setting up retainers. Before I really go into answering this question, I know we have the retainers webinar coming up in a few weeks. Are you planning on going through like an estimate setup with those retainers, with that retainer webinar as well?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think I see that. Yeah, I think I'm looking at that question here. So I'll touch on that really quickly now, but I'm really not going to get too much into it. We do have some good documentation on that, some good videos. We are doing a retainers webinar. Now it is towards the end of this particular cycle. So it's going to be, I think probably a couple of months before we do that webinar, maybe a little bit less than that actually. But the reason that it has its own webinar, and I'm not just covering, how do you do retainer webinars on this, how do you do retainer estimates on this webinar? It's just such a massive topic. There's so many different ways to do it. There's so many different, circumstances to take into account and potential, client relationships to factor in. That we really think that topic deserves its own webinar, so that's why it's getting its own. But just really quickly, when you have, if you have like a $10,000, I think, in fact, you know what? I have an example in my system here that literally matches this question exactly. So the question is, if I have a retainer for $10,000 a month and it includes multiple jobs, how do I create that? We actually have a little bit of time, so I'm going to touch on that really, really quickly. The way that you handle that is within the projects module. The projects module is basically a way of creating a folder under which multiple estimates and multiple jobs can fit under. By creating the project, I can then have all of the jobs related to the retainer flow in underneath the project. Now in this retainer, I have a retainer here for my client Safeway. It's just an example, it's just called Safeway Retainer. And on the basic info tab on the project, notice that the project has a total annual budget of $120,000. The estimate totals equal $10,000 because that is the monthly amount. $10,000, 12 months, $120,000. When I select the Job Financials tab, you'll notice the breakdown in how you create this. You want to have one billing job with an estimate that has a simple structure. So I have a single line item called Retainer Services with a value that represents how much you intend to bill each month. All of the jobs that relate to that retainer then go underneath that project for the entire year. And that could be a very long list, I know, but they all just go in there, and every single job that's a part of this retainer gets slotted underneath that retainer billing job into the project with no estimated value. They get no estimated value because you're not going to bill them for anything. They're all included in the $10,000. And you can then report on it on a month-by-month basis. And I can say, show me how we did in February. So for the month of February, my 100-hour, $10,000 monthly retainer. In the month of February, we put in 112 hours. So we went over by $1,200. And it looks like we have an invoice that yet typically an invoice value would fill in. That, of course, would be, in this example, $10,000. So that's how you handle that type of retainer. I don't know why Google is saying that this page is in German. I don't think there's any German on this page, but yeah, that's an interesting one. I almost want to hit translate and see what happens, but I'm not going to do that. Anyways, let's jump back to our estimate. Never seen it tell me that my retainer, my Safeway retainer is in German. Um, okay, so back to our estimate here. So, did I miss anything on that retainer subject, or anything that I should kind of jump back on? Do you think that was good for now?
I think that was good for now. And Tim, I'm happy to have a member of our team reach out to you to really go through your very specific retainer setup as well, so we can make sure that that's set up correctly. So if you're interested in just sending me through your email address, and I can make sure someone responds to you. I did have one more question from someone, Mark, and I know we're getting close to the top of the hour here. She just wanted you to quickly highlight the copying and estimate. Can you just pretty much hover over that button for me so we can make sure that that's clear?
Yeah, so that's actually a really good segue. So the last thing we have on our agenda is estimate templates. These last kind of 12, 15 minutes, we're going to talk about copying, templating estimates, and then also some really cool tricks around improving accuracy and potential profitability using the template and copy methods. So we can jump into that right now if you like.
That would be great. Thanks.
Okay, let's do it. All right, so before I even add this as a job, and you know what, I'm just going to go ahead and do that. Why not? Up at the top right, I'm going to select Add Job, turns this item into an active job in our system. The job is now open and it's ready to go. But let's say that I look at this and I decide, you know what, this is a really good structure for like a typical type of brochure that we would do, and I want to use it again in the future. So what I would do is I would go into my estimate. Notice that I have two different versions. This one had the multi option. I'm going to go into my active estimate. Just going to take a look at it, just make sure it all looks good to me. It does, so I'm going to choose to turn this into a template. The way that I'm going to do that is up at the top, there's a button that says Copy Estimate. If I select Copy Estimate, it's going to basically bring me to the same ad page that you'd have from the start, but with all the data filled in. I'm going to make a couple modifications. The first is I'm going to change this to be called Brochure Template. So the word template in the name, very important. The type is going to stay the same as brochure. The company is going to change. Unless this template is specific to a company, of course, then the company would be whatever you need it to be. But if it's not specific to a company, I'm going to put the company as our own company. So your own agency, your office in the system. The contact is going to be blank, because it's not applicable. And then anything else that we want fill in automatically. Description. The month close, we don't want filling in automatically. The probability, we don't want filling in automatically, so I'm going to delete that. And then anything else. So, the category, maybe we're always going to do fixed price for brochures. The delivery date, I don't want that filling in automatically either. I'm going to get rid of that. So once I have it the way that I want it, I'll submit that. I now essentially have an estimate template in the system, but there is one other step that I'd recommend that you take, and that is to click on the Basic Info tab and decline the estimate. Doing so will make sure that it never really shows up anywhere. It's never going to show up on reports, never going to show up on pipeline reporting or forecasts or anything like that. It's essentially like a dead item in the system. It's declined, but it's still available to you. So now what I can do is I can do an estimate find, and I can say in the name, show me all of my templates. Now I might narrow this down by type. I can say, show me all my brochure templates, for example, or I could just say, show me all my templates, whatever makes the most sense for you. So I'm going to say, show me all my brochure templates, click find. I think there's only one. So here's the one that we created today. And if I want to use it, I would then select it. And up at the top, I would choose to copy. And then, of course, do what I need to do. So this would be the second webinar brochure. Take out the word template. Select the client is for. So in this case is for a client called North Shore Auto Group. Choose my contact on my client. The estimate date will update automatically. Update my due date, say maybe the 4th of May. Update the description and anything else. I'm going to touch on this in just a second. But typically you'd leave this as estimated for a template. Click submit, and you now have a new version with all the same data that you had from the original. And we could go ahead then and add job or make any updates, of course, if we need to, but otherwise add job, and we now have our job open in the system. So that is how you would handle templates for estimates, and that can be very useful for a lot of different things. I mean, one, of course, the obvious answer is saving time. but then just standardization across the agency can be really helpful as well. It's something that I've seen quite a few times where I'll be working with an agency and I'll find out that they have a standard service offering. Maybe they do a lot of web development, and all of their website estimates all look completely different. They all have different line items on them. The price is spread out in different ways. There's different terminology being used, different vernacular in describing the service offering, and using this template functionality can allow you to improve the consistency across your agency. So that's an added benefit of doing so. But there is one other thing related to this copy item that I do like to touch on. It's really, really cool. I don't see a lot of people using it, maybe because it's oftentimes not the most realistic thing in the world, but it's a pretty cool feature. So let me show you what I'm talking about. You have the ability of copying the actuals from a job. So let's actually show you what that would be like. So I'm going to look at this job here, and I have a whole bunch of services and some expenses. And I'm going to populate values here, and I want to do that pretty quickly. So I'm going to open up a timesheet window. We're looking at job 30364. So I'm going to pull that open, 30364, and I'm going to put in this case, I'm going to say for research, I'm going to say I spent 4 hours. And for design, I'm going to say I spent, in this case, 27 hours. I know, of course, I'm putting in a ridiculous amount of time for a single timesheet. Bear with me. And then for copywriting, I'm going to say I spent 10. Production, maybe it was really quick this time. I'm going to say we spent 7 hours. Client management is going to be 6. Actually, no. This was a very, very tricky client. We spent 14 hours with them. And then I'm going to drop in some expenses on this really quickly as well. So I'm going to add that freelancer expense. I'm just adding in some actuals so I can show you an example of what I'm talking about here. So I'm going to add that freelancer expense. And then I'm going to add this printing expense. So don't worry about all the adding I just did. Just take a look at the end results. The end results now, notice that I have 67 hours estimated for this job coming in at $8,000. My actuals are 62 hours. So I actually came in 5 hours under budget with a total billable value of $7,800. Now I've come in $200 under budget. I can also see the estimated to actual of my expenses. And then from here, if I decide, well, I want to copy this item and I want to use the value of the actuals to create my new estimate, what I would do is I would navigate to the estimate for the job that I want to use as the baseline for my new work. And up at the top, just like before I select copy estimate, I would do everything the same as we've been looking at, only now, and I'd update the clients. So maybe it's the same client, maybe it's a different client, whatever you choose. I'm going to call this third. And notice that there is a radio button here that says actuals down at the bottom right. If I select that, that's going to add up all the timesheets and all the expenses that were actually incurred on that job and use those values to generate a new estimate. I now have an estimate that represents exactly what happened on that job. Now, it happens to be all me that did the work. Of course, you can decide if you want to use the detailed level of the staff or not. But it recreates the reality of what actually occurred. So, I know that it's not always, we don't live in a perfect world where everything is going to be, this cut and dry and this clean. But in theory, if you just kept on copying the actuals for, every round of a type of work that you have a consistent service offering of, and you do quite a bit, in theory, you become more and more accurate every single time that you did it. So that's a cool feature I'd recommend at least taking a look at and trying out. I don't see it used very much because I think it's a little bit tough to do so. But I'd love to see some people giving that a try and maybe provide some feedback on what that experience was like. So if any questions on the copying template or copying and/or template functionality that we've been talking about for the last little bit.
No, it seems everyone started to go a little bit quiet. So we're coming up on the top of the hour there, Mark. Do you think we're going to finish on time today?
Yeah, I think we're good. Hey, I'm curious. I'm looking at. Oh, okay. No one can. I have the question list up, and I was curious if attendees can see it, but it doesn't look like they can. Okay, cool. Yeah, it looks like there's some questions that I can see that you provided some answers for around, and there's some stuff around documents and stuff. Yeah, it looks like we're all sorted there, so that's good. Awesome.
And then, sorry, last one. We just had Kelly quickly jump in around the document you've been referencing the whole time. That should be in the handouts directly on your GoToWebinar control panel that you have today. So you should be able to grab it right there.
I'm going to slide over. I'm looking at one of my colleagues' computers who's watching as an attendee. So when you look at the GoToWebinar panel, there's a little tab that says Handouts and the number 1 on it. So you can just select that and you'll find the file right there. I'm also going to send, well, not myself, but our marketing department is going to send out an email to all the attendees that were in today, and then also all the registrants as well. They'll have a link to the recording as well as some files, so that file will be in there just in case you missed it. And then also some links to some other relevant documentation that relates to the to the webinar content that we covered today. But I think that, for the first time ever, which is pretty good for, having a little bit of a break, for the first time ever, we're finishing this webinar precisely on time, which never actually happens. So that's good. That's a bonus. Everyone can, go about their day, go, get into their lunch, or I guess for those on the East Coast, probably getting pretty close to shutting down for the day. So again, I just want to, thank everyone for their time today. We had a pretty good turnout, so I'm happy with that. We do have another webinar next week that is the Open Office webinar. So I'd recommend, taking a look at that. And then also in 2 weeks from today, so I just logged out of the system and noticed the webinar badge right here. If I select it, it'll bring me into the schedule. So we're in effective estimating right now. Next week is Open Office. And then the following week, we have Invoicing Part 1, Invoicing Part 2. If your company uses Function Point for your billing, this is a can't miss 2-part webinar series. Please, please, please attend it. It's going to be super useful, very, very valuable. Both are going to be recorded. You'll probably come back and refer to them a lot. We're going to solve a lot of issues in those webinars. So if you use Function Point for invoicing, definitely have a person from your company that is involved in that process in these webinars. They're going to be really good, very informative. Yeah, we'll be able to answer your questions in those as well. Okay. All right, well, I think we'll stay on here for another minute or so, just in case any other questions roll in. But as the clock ticks over to 1 Pacific, I'm seeing people starting to jump off. So again, thank you everyone for your time. Please, if you have any other questions, feel free to continue to enter them. We will stay on and answer any that come in. Any that we can't answer right now, we'll follow up with later on. Thanks again. Have a happy Wednesday and enjoy the rest of your week. Cheers. Bye now.